Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to the LIBER webinar. I don't know whether you're familiar with the LIBER architecture group, but since a couple of years, I'm the chair of the LIBER architecture group. We'll stop in April at the next seminar in Luxembourg. We're going to hear two speakers this afternoon. First, Karen Latimer, and the second speaker, Ben Meunier. But first, a little bit more about the seminar. My first LIBER architecture seminar was in 2004, and there have been 20 seminars that far. So the key of these seminars are so wonderful because it's a combination of architects and librarians. The discussions are always so interesting, and I must admit, after being chief librarian in Ghent University for 20 years now, this is really and will always be my favorite seminar to attend because it was always something that I felt enriched afterwards. The next seminar will be in Luxembourg, and you're all welcome to that. That's from the 1st of April until the 3rd of April. And it's in the brand new Learning Center of the University of Luxembourg at the fascinating Belval campus. If you haven't been there, it's really worth visiting, as well as Luxembourg City, of course. Now let's go back to our speakers. My dear Karen Latimer, during a long career, she was from the start involved in library building projects, as well in Durham in England, as in Texas in the States, as in Belfast. And she's member of several boards dealing with libraries and architecture in the UK, in LIBER, and in IFLA. She publishes, she speaks on the subject, and she's member of juries that decide on which architect is chosen to build the new library. Name it, she did it. And I must admit that I know no one who is so alert, so practical, and so lively as Karin. Our younger attendant today is Ben Meunier. He is director of UCL Library Services in London, so University College of London, and he joined the architecture board recently. But he was already involved in architectural developments as major building works in historic buildings and the UCL's new student center. Today, he leads the development of library services in UCL East, a major development to create a model for the university campus of the future. So, isn't that fascinating? And I'm sure that we can all learn a lot from him. Before giving the floor to Karen, I have to tell you one more thing. The webinar is recorded and all materials will be shared and the questions will be dealt with at the end. So, Karin, here you go.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I recognize some of the names on the list, which is a real pleasure. What we're going to do today is I am going to do a broad overview. I'll just give you the outline there, do a little bit of context setting about what's happening in library design today, and then go through the stages when you're embarking on a project. And I would just like to say at the beginning that being involved in a library project can be anything from a very small refurbishment or a little bit of work to a major library, public or university. So although one size doesn't fit all, everybody has their own type of library, there are general principles which I think we hope we can get across today. So let's just look at some general trends. And I'm picking up on the emeritus librarian from Yale, who has this sort of 3 paradigms model. So you have the book-centered library, which was really very much the libraries of the past, the reader-centered libraries, where you still have print, but a lot of reader spaces as well, to the more recent development of learning-centered libraries in the digital age. And just a couple of examples. So the Stockholm Central Library, Asplund's wonderful circular library, is very much the book-dominated example. And both Ben and myself, and indeed Sylvia, who introduced us, we were all in this library recently, the University Library at Utrecht, which has now been opened for nearly 20 years. Arts Library in Utrecht, but is still very fresh today, which, if you like, is the reader-centered. A lot of work went into finding out how readers use the library. And then my example, if you want, of the learning-focused library is the Hunt Library in North Carolina, where the book collections are underground in storage, and the space was released for different learning spaces and maker spaces. And really, about 5 or 6 years ago, I wrote an article in a journal called Library Trends. We called it Collections to Connections. And I think that that is the sort of trend in library design, that we have moved from the kind of libraries that didn't really change much over the years to ones now in the 21st century, which are very flexible and are perhaps more welcoming and are focused on learning. So hence from the focus on how much room the book collections take and the spaces between the stacks to this whole business of connections between our users and the services. But what remains constant, of course, is good design, the wow factor, functionality, whatever you want to call it, and that remains constant, whatever century you're in. And a few examples, then you have the very famous Radcliffe, the camera in Oxford, the late 18th century, and the National Library in Sweden. Two examples, if you want, of 18th, 19th century library design. And then moving into the buildings of the late 20th and 21st century, the Seattle Public Library, which is generally considered the one that changed the way people thought about designing libraries. And the Black Diamond in Copenhagen on the right, my right of the screen, which again changed the way we thought about national libraries. And an example from the UK of a public library that opened quite recently in the north of England called The Word, where the emphasis was on designing a building that was not only about accessing knowledge and getting information, but also about creating it. And on the university side, I still think one of the university libraries we can learn a lot from is the one in Delft. And it was very interesting because I spoke to the architect of this building, and she said it was her alma mater, and she had this idea of designing a library that was very much focused on the book. And it was the librarian who said, oh, no, we want the digital to be every bit as important as the book. And Delft, although it was originally designed in the late 20th century, did quite a major makeover about 10 years ago to move further into the idea of the learning centre. And just a couple of other examples, which I think are good if you want. We'll talk about looking at libraries to visit or read about, is that the University of Helsinki Library in Helsinki, which was, and the interesting point about this library, I think, is that when we're thinking of designing a new library and thinking about our architects, we often think about track records and what has this practice done before. But what Helsinki did was it was a competition, and the winners of the competition were a young practice, almost straight out of architecture school. So, long-lived youth don't necessarily only depend on the track record. You can get very brilliant ideas and new ideas from young practices. A trend that we're noticing in the world of library design, and very much in this age of climate change and sustainability, is refurbishing existing buildings, whether they be ready libraries or other types of buildings. And a couple of examples of this for scene setting. This is the Weston Library in Oxford, which was the new Bodleian when it was built in the 1930s and has just had a major makeover, which I think is a very successful example. And if we're talking about planning spaces, the brief was very much that this had to be a serious research library, but also accessible to the public. So it has its front-facing exhibition areas, but still very serious research space. And that leads me on then to the background research. So when you're starting on a project, whether it's big or small, being good librarians, and I hesitate to tell this audience how to do a literature search, but I thought I should at least mention there's lots of information out there. And just remember, don't just check the library information science databases, but also look at architecture ones like the Royal Institute of British Architects catalogue or the Avery. So the architecture side and the library side. I'll come back to the organisations, but also there are the two main organisations in the field are LIBER, which Sylvia has already spoken to you about, and IFLA, the international group, which also has an architecture section. There are a lot of websites, and we'll talk about them again in a minute. And the other very useful way of preparing for building or doing a new library project is to look at what other people have done, either by going on visits and making sure you're well prepared before you do that, and networking with your colleagues. One example, just in passing, is the New Review of Academic Librarianship had a very interesting article quite recently on how users learn. But there's a lot of information like that out there that you can use when you're starting to think about your project. And I mentioned the organizations, and Sylvia has already mentioned this year's seminar. As well as that, if you look on the website, there are publications from previous seminars that will tell you about other libraries that have been designed. And the really hot news off the press is that the database is undergoing a major new version, and in the next few months, we hope in April it will be launched, and that will be a very useful source of information for anybody working on a project. Again, the IFLA Library Buildings and Equipment, they too do conferences. They do an annual session at the major World Congress. This year it's in Dublin, and they also do mid-year seminars, and this year it's in Montreal. And again, they have publications. The one that gets used, or I get asked about most often, is the IFLA Library Building Guidelines. And as one of its editors, I can admit that it does need to be updated, but it still has useful information. And again, plenty of advice from members and on the website. I mentioned Designing Libraries as a very useful website that you can use. It is a great resource for library planning. It showcases libraries from around the world. It also has a database, but mainly UK-based. But as well as a showcase, it has a marketplace. So there's a lot of information about library suppliers and furniture suppliers, shelving suppliers, that kind of thing. So another very useful source. So let's move on to planning your library. You're setting off to do this new space, whatever it is. And I just wanted to highlight a few things to think about. I think one of the challenges is obviously you're going to use the data you have to hand, but equally so, you're trying to be creative and project into the future. I can't remember who said it, was it Mark Twain who said, you know, if you're trying to imagine the future, the best way to do it is to design it yourself. So in a sense, that's what you're doing. You're balancing the kind of safe estimates, but throwing in a bit of risk. And quite often when I talk to librarians about library design, they say, oh, the architect always wants, you know, the wow factor. We want the building to work. But I mean, obviously, what we all want is both. And what you're trying to do, and you'll all be working in different sorts of organizations, is to capture the values of your institution, your users, your community. And as I said before, you know, the general principles apply, whether it's a small building, a university library or a public library or whatever. In a university sense, and that's what we're really focusing on here in LIBER, is you're really trying to get at how space influences learning. And I know Ben will be picking up when he shows you his wonderful case study on the work he's done here. So when you're writing the brief or the program or the memorandum of understanding, whatever words you want to use, but basically you're trying to communicate to your community and your architects what kind of building you want. So the vision word, you know, vision is kind of overused, but really there is no better word. And I suppose what it is, it's your idea for this library, your dream if you want, but also based obviously in factual reality. And as once you've worked out that, then you need to articulate it and communicate it to everybody. And I know you don't need to be told this, you all know it, but we do need to all remember that we want everybody to feed into the process. Our own staff, don't forget your own library staff, and of course the users. And again, sometimes librarians say to me, well, you know, I'm a librarian, I don't want to get into all this space thing. And all I would really say is space and the service you want to provide are inseparable. Good space means that libraries can achieve their goals, deliver a top-class service. Poor space has the opposite effect. So yes, we need to respect each other's professions and listen to each other, but we're aiming for the same thing. Now, I just wanted to show you a few examples. Now, and in a short space of time, we can't look at a whole brief, but I'm trying to pick out what the key things behind these 3 examples. You can pick any examples. So one example is the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and this was what they talked about. They wanted to benchmark against the best, and one of the best was the Karolinska Institute. I think there might be somebody in the audience from that. But they picked really good examples and looked at them, and they were all about learning. They wanted to put learners at the centre, and they were bold. They took brave decisions that were maybe controversial, but they really pushed the boat out, if you want. That's their building in Dublin. Quite a lot older is the David Wilson Library in Leicester, but I really like their brief and the things they thought about. This is quite a long time ago, this was the late 20th century. So they were saying they wanted it to be welcoming, but they wanted it to be a serious building as well. They wanted to be somewhere you could stay in for a long time, which is important for a university library. They wanted a lot of choice. The encouraging positive behaviours is an interesting one to think about when you're planning space. And obviously they wanted it to be attractive and easy to use. And at much more high levels, that's the University of Leicester there, just an example of it. I'm really not talking about the design qualities here. I'm trying to get at how they decided, how they communicated what they wanted to achieve. And then you can have something like the National Library in Latvia, which is a very high level vision, if you like, which was all about symbolism, this glass mountain. But they also wanted it to relate to their own traditional architecture. And that's what they produced as a result of their brief. And this one I haven't seen, I have to admit. A friend of mine sent it to me, and I think it's in that world, best libraries in the world. My nephew was working in China, and I sent him off to take this picture. But the interesting thing about that brief was it was all about sustainability, as you can probably tell, and the joy of reading, which I thought was rather a nice brief to have. So let's move on to the practical side. You're developing the brief. What do you need to think about? Obviously, your users. Increasingly now, we don't just ask our users, we watch what they do in existing spaces, which provides often better data. So you can use surveys, customer journey maps, etc. There's a lot of ways of finding out about your users. The other thing to think about is your current service. What do you do well? What do you not do well? And you can't do well because of the space that you're currently in, and you'd like your new space to enable. So you're trying to think, is there anything that you don't do now that you would like to do in the future? And remember, your staff want decent spaces too. And keep the key qualities in mind. I'm not going to go into this slide in any detail because it's in the IFLA Library Buildings Guidelines. But Harry Faulkner Brown, who was an architect who specialised in library architecture, devised these qualities of good library space many years ago, I think in the 70s or 80s. And it's been developed since mainly by members of the IFLA Library Buildings section. Pretty well common sense. The two I quite like, which are quite new, are the interactive. You're trying to create spaces that enable contact between users and the services and the library staff and each other, and also conducive, motivating, inspiring spaces. But as I said, we'll not dwell on that one. So then you've thought about what kind of library you want, and you're now trying to actually turn it into reality. The design is starting. As the leaders of the project, if indeed you are, you have to hold true to your vision, but be flexible at the same time. Communicate, make endless decisions. Somebody once said to me, it felt like they were making 100 decisions a day and then nothing would happen for a while and they think, are we still building this building? Also remember that you can start planning your library well ahead of the actual end date. So you will suddenly have some new demands in the middle of the project, hence the need for these memorandum of understanding between yourselves and the designers. And so the bottom line really is my key point here. It's all about dialogue, talking, and making modifications where necessary. Just a quick tip on the side, I really advise you to learn how to read simple preliminary plans. again, there's a chapter in the guidelines book on this. Construction documents are far too complex for most of us, but do walk around your existing building with its plans, walk around the virtual building with plans, and ask your architects to explain the various lines and symbols. But it really does help communication if you understand how the plans work. You're getting closer now to the building coming to fruition, more decisions, more troubleshooting, final thoughts about your various service points, self-service versus service points. Even things like your signage and art. I'm a great believer in art in libraries, so if you can get somebody, some countries have a percentage that allow you to have art in your building. And then you get on to the move and the opening, which very often is perhaps out of your hands. I always think this is the kind of phase of exhaustion followed by euphoria. Now, one of the things that is really useful when you are planning a library is to visit other libraries. And I'm very keen on post-occupancy evaluation anyway, as what they call the continuous loop of improvement, so that you learn from what other people have done. But basically, it's the same thing, whether you're visiting a library before you design your library or evaluating your own library afterwards. What you're trying to measure are the outcomes. How is the building? How does it work for the users and the staff? And sometimes it's interesting to ask the library directors or project leaders, do they feel that the building did indeed fulfill the brief? Did you get the right number of spaces? Are there enough reader spaces or whatever kind of spaces, group study rooms, whatever? And are they in the right place? Are they beside the right things? And what we're trying to do is get spaces that enable better learning and provide a better experience. So it's good to ask people, how is that working? And what we call the fairy question is always good to ask. Is there anything that they would change? If they could wave their magic wand, what would they change? What really works and what doesn't really work? And there's plenty of information on how POE stands for post-occupancy evaluation, generally known as POE. There is a questionnaire on the IFLA website. It's far too long, and I helped devise it, so I can say that, but you can pick little bits of it. You don't have to use it. And have a look at how your users are using the new building or the building you're visiting, and obviously ask people. And I think that is pretty well me. I finished with an image of the University of Luxembourg, where the seminar is to be held in April, to entice you all to come and meet Ben and Sylvia and myself. And I'd now like to hand over to Ben, who is going to talk to you about a practical, real live case study. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that masterclass in library planning and design. I certainly learned a few things from the presentation. So I'll be talking, as Karen said, about the Student Centre at UCL, which opened almost a year ago to the day, opened on the 15th of February last year. And I'll talk a bit about the principles which Karen spoke about in her presentation, how we apply them in this specific case study of the Student Centre. So one of the first challenges we have with libraries when we're speaking to architects is around the word library. And when we say, please design us a library, these pictures are the first thing that springs to mind to many architects, particularly those who are laden with awards from the past few decades of design. And that can be a challenge, both in talking to designers, but also to our own estates colleagues. When you start talking to them about designing new libraries, these are the kinds of spaces that immediately come to their minds. And so we have to do a piece of work around educating our colleagues and our designers about what our expectations are, and moving from that book-centric model to more learning-centric approaches to libraries, and then kind of address the types of spaces that we now expect from our libraries around the globe, and how the place of the book is changing within our libraries in relation to learners and other types of resources. Within UCL, libraries have been an integral part of the university since it opened. This is a plan of the Wilkins Building, which Karen and I are sitting in right now. And the original UCL building opened in 1826, and the space was laid out with these two rectangles on either side of the central portico. On the right-hand side was the library, and on the left-hand side was the museums. And UCL was founded as a university where learning was around learning from objects and learning from resources, essentially learning from research that was going on in the world around England at the time, rather than adopting the practices that Oxford and Cambridge had established as the two universities in England for education, where you kind of had more didactic learning and you were just told to a large extent what to learn. And UCL famously didn't teach theology or music. Those are two subjects that aren't taught at UCL. And it was more about applied sciences, and many sciences like engineering were founded at UCL in terms of establishing, certainly in England, practical applications for science and understanding that. And that is something that runs in UCL's DNA from the time it was founded all the way to today. And then in terms of aligning the values of the new student centre with the original UCL values, that is something that what we were bearing in mind in terms of what's the role of the library in the university, that place at the heart of the university where learning happens. That's not to say that we don't have traditional library spaces. The image in black and white at the bottom there is one of our reading rooms from around the time of the Second World War. It was bombed during the Blitz, so it's kind of slightly reconfigured subsequently, but it has got that wooden panelling and lots of shelving, much like the reading rooms and library spaces that you might have seen and that you can trace back all the way to the medieval era and to St. Jerome even further back, busily translating the Bible at his desk with his book on the desk. And that is something which, so those images from our special collections and the learning spaces that we had all the way to the 1950s, 1960s, and even further, were very much replicas of previous versions of the library, and that emphasis on collections rather than connections. And one of the things that we were very keen to address was thinking about what is the role of the library in learning today. And libraries haven't always been about exclusively or primarily about books. They have been also at times about bringing people together with common interests of finding new ways of explaining what's going on in the world and understanding different perspectives. And that was something that we really wanted to recreate in the Student Centre, opportunities for connection between members of our UCL community. And this is kind of reflecting on thinking about the library of the future. Sometimes can be limited by looking at the libraries of the past. The image on the right, many of you may be familiar with, probably Karen knows exactly what it is, the long room at Trinity College Dublin. And the image on the left may be less familiar, but it's the Jedi archives from the second film in the Star Wars sagas. And you can see, obviously, the creators of this digital futuristic library, albeit a long, long time ago, thinking about what the library of kind of space looks like, looks very traditional, and resources are still at the centre. In fact, you can't really see any space for users within the library. So in terms of the emphasis and the role of the library, that is something which is worth bearing in mind. It also exemplifies a poor service that the Jedi use in the library get. And I had a video, but I won't have time to show it to you. But if you watch that episode 2 of Star Wars, you can see what I'm talking about. Now, moving on to the Student Centre and its place within UCL. So UCL has a 20-year strategy that was launched in 2014, so it's called UCL 2034. And our library strategy within the university is very closely aligned to UCL 2034. And we felt like it was important for the Student Centre to be an embodiment of the key targets and objectives that UCL has set itself for the next 20 years. So if I can just talk briefly about that, UCL's strategy is articulated around 6 principal themes, which are primarily around the academic mission of the university, and 6 key enablers, which are the ways that UCL is going to deliver its academic goals. The second principal theme is particularly relevant in the context of library services and what it is that we're about. So as a university, UCL is about research-based education and integrating the 2 strands of activity that happen in universities, of research and teaching and learning. And that was something which UCL feels is critical to creating a positive, meaningful student experience. So it's not just about shiny buildings and cafes, it's also about thinking, what is it that students get out of university that is different from what they might get in any other place? And UCL does have research strengths that it's carried forwards over decades and over a century. And that was something that was really important to build into education in a way that hadn't always been previously, when UCL's focus was on research leadership, and this UCL 2034 strategy emphasised the importance of integrating research and education. And so we talk now about, rather than being a research-led institution, being a research-based institution and delivering a research-based education. The other strand, which relates to library services and the student centre, is under the key enablers. And you can see the first one is about giving our students the best support, facilities and opportunities, and creating a life-changing opportunity. And that is really what UCL's estate work is around providing our students with outstanding facilities. And the penultimate bullet point on the right-hand side of the page, around maintaining a sustainable estate to meet our aspirations. The emphasis there was recognising that a lot of work needed to be done on our estate across the piece to bring it up to a better standard, but also that sustainability shouldn't just be something that our researchers engage in and develop good practice and findings around how can we make the world more sustainable. It was actually about how can the university embody that in practice, and how can we deliver buildings and an estate that is sustainable. And all of these things are captured in the student centre. These two images just exemplify what we mean by research-based education. On the left-hand side is an artistic rendition, really, of what we call the connected curriculum, which was developed by Li Feng, who was a professor at UCL. She was the lead of our Centre for Learning and Teaching and the advancement of learning and teaching. And the connected curriculum really is a framework for how can we deliver research-based education. And a lot of these strands relate to connecting students to one another, to connecting students with the research that happens at the university, and the academics in the university being able to share their cutting-edge research with students in practice. And all of these things seem like really valuable elements, and it wasn't always clear previously how the library contributed to those agendas, but having it documented so clearly in this almost manifesto for research-based education has helped us to be able to find ways of creating spaces and developing our services to deliver that research-based education. On the right-hand side are what are called the UCL Grand Challenges, and those are ways for UCL to articulate what are the big social global themes that UCL is trying to make better. So why is it that the university is doing this research? It's to make sure that human well-being is improved over time, that justice and equality becomes a reality going forwards. And those grand challenges were something that we felt we wanted to illustrate in the Student Centre. And I'll tell you a bit more about how we've gone about doing this going forwards, but it's one of the UCL distinctive elements is interdisciplinary research, and this is a way of presenting how UCL undertakes its interdisciplinary research. So in terms of the creating an outstanding user experience, you saw that was in UCL 2034. It's also one of our library strategy high-level objectives, and some of the initial feedback we received relating to the Student Centre on social media, you can see kind of starts to give a flavour of how that was delivered and how it felt to visitors and students at the university when we started delivering the new building. And the mission of the library, as set out in our strategy, is about providing the infrastructure to enable UCL to undertake high quality research and education. So you can see that in terms of our mission, and the library strategy is available online, so you can look at that in more detail. UCL launched a master plan in 2011, and that helped to articulate for the whole university what it was that we wanted to do with our estate. And one of the things that came out from that estate strategy was creating hubs, so that each faculty, each unit within UCL felt like it had a home rather than being dispersed, because with now 42,000 students, UCL is a very big place, and it can be quite difficult to feel like you have a home within the university when you're working at that scale. And so this idea of hubs was something which felt to our designers and estates colleagues, and indeed senior academic leaders, like a way of creating more of a sense of belonging within the university. And Library Services took the opportunity really to kind of suggest that hubs could be something that the library could manage as a resource, because in many cases, the place which faculty and students feel is their home when they're not being taught or when they're not outside of the university is indeed the library. And so that was a relatively clear vision for us, that we could provide this facility to the university. And indeed, we had the opportunity shortly after to create an example of what it is that we meant by a library as a hub. So the UCI Medical School is partly based in the Cruciform Building, which is just across the road from where Karen and I are. We can see it through the window that you can see on the video there. And within the medical school, there was a relatively small library that was opened in the 1990s. And it felt quite tired. It didn't have power. It had an issue desk in the middle of the quiet reading room, and it didn't have any spaces for collaboration. The medical school was looking at its curriculum to change it to be more project-based, and so there was a real need for more collaborative working. So we're working with our estates colleagues, with medical school, and with UCL students, we were able to recreate what we meant by a library. And the Cruciform Hub was the first model really at UCL where we combined social learning, individual study spaces, IT within quiet learning spaces. And you can see we still had some books. We reduced the print collections by about 50% as part of the project, but it's enabled us to create this space which actually eventually extended the footprint of the library. And the bottom right picture that you can see on the screen, which has got these squiggles, is actually an image from UCL students. So it's an image of research of spinal cord under the microscope. And it's one of the motifs that adorns the Cruciform Hub and shows the kind of biomedical research that happens at the university, not in a kind of in-your-face way, but just indicates that this is a biomedical themed space. Now, the Student Centre is a hub on a much larger scale, and it is for all UCL students. So whereas the Cruciform Hub was for medical students, the Student Centre was envisaged as a hub for all students across the university, which makes the briefing slightly more challenging because you have a much wider audience to engage with. And whereas with the Cruciform we could interact through existing channels with the student population, and medical students responded really well to our engagement, it was a large piece to try and understand who our users were. UCL's student population is over 50% postgraduate, so that is another factor which is interesting in terms of the nature of UCL as a university. Unlike all other UK universities, our population is primarily postgraduate and slightly under 50% of undergraduates. In terms of where the Student Centre physically is, again, you can see the UCL Wilkins Building at the front of at the bottom of the picture there. So the Student Centre is the block behind the Wilkins Building, and so it's right at the centre of UCL's campus. It's the last plot of land really on the Bloomsbury campus that hadn't been rebuilt since the Second World War, and it used to be the Great Hall of UCL, which was bombed as well during the war, and UCL hadn't redeveloped since the 50s. In terms of the nature of the building, we have 1,000 spaces within the building, including 300 computers, and that was a discussion that we had in terms of the briefing, looking ahead 5, 10, 20 years. Do we need computers for our students? And this was very much in response to student demands that we provided fixed computers and laptops for loaning so that students can borrow IT, and it was very important to our students to be able to borrow computers. And indeed, it is something that is very heavily used. The building is open 24 hours a day, year round, and it has 7 floors, 2 of which are below ground and 5 above ground. It also has a small outdoor terrace, which, despite the British weather, is very well used. And you can see the size of the building is just under 6,000 square meters. And one of the features, I mentioned sustainability earlier and the importance of developing a sustainable estate. One of the features of the building is that we have 2 boreholes which help to regulate the temperature of the building. And the Student Centre has got accreditation as an outstandingly environmentally sustainable building, which we're very proud of because it's the first UCL building to obtain that accreditation, and it does match up with the ways that the building is operating. It is very sustainable, despite the fact it's had over 1.5 million users in the year since it's opened. So it's very intensively used, but it's also very sustainable, and it was developed with that in mind to demonstrate the university sustainability. So this just shows you the overall layout of the building, but I won't dwell on that very much. It just shows you those 5 floors above ground and 2 below. What I want to talk about, which Karen touched on earlier, is student engagement and how you actually bring your users to feed into the design, because it can be difficult when you're working with busy individuals across the campus, a community of students and staff who have many other things to do. And so what we did was to adopt a multi-pronged approach to engagement and to try and ask students and staff to take part in the process of planning the building. So we started in 2012, and we commissioned Alexi Marmot Associates. Alexi Marmot is actually a professor here at UCL in the Bartlett School of the Built Environment, and her consultancy firm surveyed over 1,000 students, also did some student observations, and helped to develop really a brief that was very clear about what are the main things that UCL students wish that they had on campus that this building can deliver in terms of improving the learning experience. In addition to that, we undertook a number of kind of play or show and tells that the architects did with students. The library commissioned some work where we also went around and looked at behaviours of students within our spaces. And throughout the project, at different scales, we tried to continue engaging with students where we could. So for instance, in the latter part of the project, in 2017, we undertook a number of furniture trials to try and see what type of furniture students responded to better and which we should actually procure, and any types of furniture that the architects might feel was appropriate, but students didn't use as much. And so that helped us to get some more qualitative data about the types of furniture that students wanted. Unusually for projects, we had some student representation on the boards, and that proved quite helpful in terms of both having a sense of ownership, that students should be owners of a student centre, but also as a precedent for other UCL projects. And this is something that, as the university talks about working in partnership with students, we can really exemplify that by involving students at all levels of decision making. So users don't necessarily just need to be engaged through surveys and workshops. They can actually also be part of the governance of projects, and that was quite a powerful tool to make sure that students had a say in the way that the building was developed, and indeed how it's been received since it has opened. So in terms of our key requirements, as we set out from Library Services, these are the key points that we've expressed to architect teams, to designers for the interior design, and you can see many of the things here echo the points that Karen made earlier about the type of space that we wanted to create for our students. In terms of the way that the space is laid out, one of the factors that we considered based on site visits in other institutions and on good practice from areas was to try and make sure that the atrium, which almost is inevitably a feature of most modern library buildings, was physically separate from the quiet study spaces. So on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see those blue zones have got a wall with doors that physically separates the atrium, which is noisier, from the quiet space. And that was a challenge for our designer colleagues to make sure that they could maintain the sustainability credentials and airflow within the building, but it has meant that we can have literally a jazz band playing on the ground floor with student societies performing and students studying quietly on the second floor without worrying about what's going on outside. So that is functionally has really helped us a lot with creating the type of environment where students can be themselves and showcase all of their talents and use the building as it should for whatever they want to do. So we have this terrace on the top floor, which has proven a really great asset for student well-being, and it is somewhere that students go to relax, to get a bit of fresh air and to get some beautiful views of the campus. We were a bit sceptical about the benefits of having outdoor space in central London, but we did see it in a number of Scandinavian libraries and felt like it probably was worth trialing. But based on this trial, we feel like it is a kind of space that has got benefits in incorporating within library designs. And as part of the wellbeing agenda that is a growing theme, it is something which we feel has worked very well. We have, within the building, in terms of services, we have a student inquiries centre, so that is almost a one-stop shop for student inquiries. It's not managed by library services, but it forms part of the overarching service envelope for the building, and it's managed by our colleagues in student and registry services, and that delivers answers to any type of query that you might have as a student, whether it's about your student status, your fees, support and wellbeing services, and so on and so forth. So that is provided on the first floor of the building. And one of the characteristics that we wanted for the student centre to have was that it should be distinctively UCL. So it couldn't be distinctively about a specific discipline, but we could, for instance, incorporate images of UCL research within the spaces so that students could just wander around the building. And we talk a lot about serendipity in terms of collections and the loss of collections, meaning that you lose serendipity, but you can still inspire and pique users' interests by just providing images of what's going on in the university in the broadest sense, and then try and create engagement through that way. So we do have a number of these images throughout the building with small interpretation plaques that just explain what it is that you're looking at. And that image on the bottom right corner, for instance, looks a bit like fluids, kind of chemical image, but it's actually two cows drinking from a small river in a desert. So it's interesting that what you see isn't necessarily what you expect to be facing in the university. We also have some public art that's been commissioned and delivered by UCL alumni and also by UCL professors. So we try and showcase, as I mentioned earlier, the full set of talents of the university's students and staff and alumni, which is really important. So library staff within the building have got a role in supporting students, making sure that the building is managed and that it is fit for purpose, and it is something that we work very closely with colleagues from different parts of the university, and the building really has helped us to work collaboratively with other parts of the university services to make sure that the provision of services in the building meets any needs that students might have as they come to us. So that the building does feel inspiring and inclusive. And we have had positive comments from disabled student societies about how inclusive the building is, which is quite a difference from other areas of UCL. So that is something that we are particularly proud of. In terms of the way that the building is managed and overseen, we have a student centre steering group, which is chaired by myself. So it's led by Library Services. But it brings together all of the different stakeholders and service providers in the building, and it has enabled us to work more closely as a university community. So it's not just a really great building, but it's also helping us to work in new ways which are more collaborative and incorporate the Students' Union as well as these different services. So really that brings me to some concluding remarks about the role of the library in the digital age of creating a place to study, somewhere that feels safe and that students can get answers to any questions that they have. And it's also happening in parallel with work that we're doing within the library to provide information and share information that's generated in the university with the world in an open access way. So I'll just skip to my concluding remarks, which is, with the Student Centre and our work around hubs, we are connecting users not only with each other, but also with UCL's research. And that is something that's really important in terms of the role of academic libraries, is that students, visitors feel like they are connecting with the research that's happening. We're delivering the life-changing experience by providing this range of services and facilities within the building, which the university strategy and vision drives us towards, so we can clearly show alignment between the building and the university strategy. And an important factor within that strategy is students being partners in the university enterprise, and indeed staff, academic staff and professional services staff being partners in this community. And the way that we engage with our users can help us to embed that culture and take that forwards over time beyond the building opening, and it is something that is a mindset rather than just being about the building. So those were the key points really that I found from the Student Centre project in terms of going forwards. And I think it's now time for any questions you might have for Karen or myself. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ben and Karen. I don't know whether you can see it on your screen, but there have been a lot of clapping hands of applause for your two presentations. Ben, I must admit, I love that picture with the two drinking cows.
Yes.
So amazing. So you were both very clear in your presentations, and the public was very attentive, as you could see. There are only two questions, and I think one of them is especially for Ben also. It's from Constantina, who says, can you tell us a bit more about refurbishing old neoclassical buildings and use them as libraries? I think this is part of what you did in the past, isn't it, Ben?
It is. So I think the Wilkins Building, which you saw the plans of, is an example of neoclassical architecture. William Wilkins, who the building is named after, designed the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. And the Cruciform Hub is in a Grade 2 listed building, which was also designed by a very famous architect, Alfred Waterhouse, who designed the Natural History Museum in Kensington. So both of those, we've done a number of projects within those spaces, which were to improve the spaces. I'll start with the Wilkins Building, which was, as I said earlier, partly designed as a library to start with. And that is a blessing and a curse in some respects, because it was designed as a library, as was Cutting Edge in 1826. And so it can be quite challenging when it's designed to meet the needs of very print-heavy spaces, very cellular spaces to enable quiet concentration, to create more digital-friendly learning environments within this building. So one of the ways that we've tried to focus is to create really high-spec individual learning spaces within this building, and to concentrate on provision of social and group workspaces in other bits of the estates that are quite close by. I mean, and the Student Centre itself is an example where we've concentrated a lot of new social learning and group study spaces in that building, and we haven't made as many radical interventions as we would have needed to if we only had this building to operate in. So I think it's about thinking about what you need as an institution and how to make it fit for purpose. And this space really does lend itself to this kind of space. But I think over time we probably will be looking at more radical interventions to create more digitally enabled spaces. The Cruciform Hub we were more innovative with, and we've tried to use the quirky nature of the building, which is a cross-shaped building, so it's got lots of funny angles and corners, and to actually make a feature of those, and to create little booths and within those corners. So we've been able to use where the building was designed, so that quirkiness, to make it to use zones as quirky group study spaces. But Karen has got a wealth of experience in that area, so she can probably...
No, perhaps I could just add in, IFLA are working at the moment on a book which is called Libraries in Old Buildings. Now, it's not necessarily libraries, there are abattoirs and churches and warehouses, but it's been fascinating to look at these buildings and to talk to the people who run them, and they will say, generally speaking, they're very positive about the advantages of the old building, both sustainably and because they're already loved and landmarks. The problems tend to be, as Ben has touched on perhaps a slight reduction in flexibility, and some of the environmental things can be a bit tricky, but people are working on that a lot at the moment. So keep your eye out, Constantina, for the book, which I think is due out sometime towards the end of 2020, Libraries in Old Buildings.
So I will add a second question that comes along with this one from Hup, who says, he wants that book that IFLA will publish, because they are at the moment, they are Oh, I lost my thread because there are new questions coming in. So, but Huub says that they are transforming an 18th century coach house into a library. So that's why he wants the book. But another thing he wants to know is whether you have any experience with augmented reality in the library and or RFID tagging or other tools for integrating physical books with digital resources. Do you?
Sorry, Sylvia, can you repeat that last bit to the question?
So Hip asks whether you have experience with augmented reality
Yes.
or
Okay.
RFID tagging or other tools
Yes.
integrating physical books with digital resources.
Yeah, sorry. So on the RFID tagging elements, all of our collections are now RFID tagged across the whole of UCL Library Services, and the integration of physical books and digital resources is really done through our library catalogue. So it doesn't really have to do with the RFID technology as such, but we have upgraded our catalogue about 2 years ago now to Alma, so ex-Libris product, and that it does help with the browsing of collections side by side, digital and physical. In terms of augmented reality, that's a really good question. It is something that we tried. We trialed in the Cruciform Hub with our exhibitions. So we had physical exhibitions of biomedical objects and even specimens. So from our hospital collections, and one of the products that we actually developed was an augmented reality app so that you could interpret the objects in the case using the using your iPhone or whatever device you had. And we worked in a collaboration with our colleagues in the Petrie Museum Egyptology for that. It was quite labor intensive, and the first exhibition used some elements of it, but actually it was very hard to sustain. So we've not really been able to continue with doing that in our existing libraries, but it is something that we want to kind of explore going forwards. I don't know, Karen, if there's much.
No, I can't add much on augmented reality. I'll leave that to the young Ben. But on the 18th century coach house Huub, I don't know if you can get to Dublin for the IFLA conference. Architects that I've been working with in Dublin are currently working on 18th century houses in Dublin that they're turning into the new city, part of the new city library project. So if you've got any spare time in August, do come to Dublin and you'll hear more.
Okay, I go over to another question. So Gerald says that you have a very high percentage at UCL of postgraduate students who are independent learners. But he asks, how have the undergraduates reacted to the new design?
Okay, well, that's an easy one. So undergrads love the student centre, and it is used very much by undergraduates and postgraduates. Within our briefing requirements, we were very clear we wanted a mature space, somewhere that felt like you could undertake serious work and it wasn't too zingy and not too colourful, and no bean bags was one of the specification requirements. And our students overwhelmingly really appreciate it. It's not as formal as this main library, the Wilkins Building, which also undergraduates do really like because it's got that historic character to it. But it is something which I think sometimes we are tempted to almost patronise our undergraduate students, but we also need to bear in mind that they are professionals within a few months of leaving university. And so the types of spaces that they need to work in and that they expect to work in are that kind of transition between school and the workplace. And our undergraduates have really appreciated the spaces that we've provided in the student centre as those kinds of more mature spaces that are almost like open plan creative offices that you might then go on to, whether it's a startup or an established firm, find those spaces or something that is familiar when you go and graduate and move into the workplace.
Okay, and then the very last question by Lenka. She asks what your opinion is on the work of the architect Art Vos, who, by the way, will be one of the speakers at Luxembourg, and especially on his idea of the library as a third place?
Oh, thanks, Lenka. I hope you're going to come to Luxembourg. I think APFOS is very much about placemaking. It's his big thing, rather than individual library designs, and he's very inspiring, well worth coming to hear. The third place, the idea of the library of third place has been about for really quite a long time now, but I think it's still valid, the idea, and I think Ben touched on this when he said one of the visions for the student centre was a sort of a home, if you like, where you're not in a lecture, so you're not part of that, you're not sitting in your student accommodation or whatever, and so the library is this place which is everybody can call their own. So I think it's still a very strong concept. It was the Oldenburg was the one who came up with it, not so much for libraries, but this idea of a third place, wherever it is, isn't your work, isn't your home, but it's somewhere else. So I think it is still a very valid concept. And certainly, yes, I think APFOS is very inspiring. I had a talk with him recently about his paper in Luxembourg, and he had to depart to sort out his cat who'd knocked something over in the middle of it. So he endeared himself to me very much. He's very interesting. Thank you for the question.
So this means that this webinar is over. Thank you so much, Karen and Ben, for the very interesting talks and the very nice pictures you used. And I hope that a lot of you will attend the LIBER seminar in Luxembourg, and I can tell it's really worth attending, and you will learn a lot from it. So wherever you are, have a nice afternoon and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for attending.